All right. So welcome everyone. Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, great. 1 second. Oh. Okay, great. So session moderators today. Hello everyone, my name is Miriam Rodriguez and I'm going to be moderating today with Danae Schmidt, who is the Senior Membership Coalitions Manager, and I am the Senior Coalitions Relations Coordinator at USBC. So the Growing Coalitions Technical Assistance Series is part of a 7-part series uniquely designed for state, territorial, local, tribal, cultural coalitions, and these will cover a range of topics that are salient to every type of coalition in the first food field. These topics will range from communications to advocacy to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And access to these sessions are completely free, but space is limited. So please keep an eye out for more information about each session and register for those sessions that most interest you. During today's sessions, we do ask that you keep your mic muted and they use the chat box to ask any questions or share comments. So today's topic will cover trauma and breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is an incredibly personal experience, and as such, many factors can influence an individual's choice to initiate, continue, or end their breastfeeding journey. Trauma, whether historical or personal, can be a key indicator in breastfeeding outcomes. In this era of racial reckoning and pandemic-related isolation, how can coalitions support communities that have experienced trauma in achieving their breastfeeding goals? And with that, I'm happy to pass it over to today's subject experts. Stefana, I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself and the rest of our facilitators.
Hello. Today I introduce to you Linda Kopecki with the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition and the Twin Cities Regional Breastfeeding Coalition, and Candy Cornelius with the Oneida Breastfeeding Group and the Native Breastfeeding Coalition of Wisconsin, member of the Oneida and Menominee Nation of Wisconsin. And along with myself, hello again, my name is Stefana Repnicki. I am with the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation Breastfeeding Coalition, the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, and I'm a recognized member of the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas. Slide. Objectives. Oops, hold on. Objectives. Describe the ways that chest breastfeeding practices and outcomes may be impacted by personal historical trauma and in ways that are different in different communities. Identify ways to find for coalitions to facilitate equity learning journeys with particular attention to the impacts trauma may have on chest breastfeeding. Identify what is needed to build coalitions that are inclusive and welcoming. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is a journey for individuals, coalitions, organizations, and communities. It is difficult work and is likely to expose assumptions, norms, and long-held beliefs that are harmful to others. It may be a long journey. All of the planners and facilitators on this webinar are on that journey. USBC wants to support breastfeeding coalitions of all sizes and types to embark on that journey. This 2-hour session is not about doing the hard work for you, but it will provide resources, tools, and conversation prompts for you and your coalition to take the first steps on that journey. Slide. Why we all need to engage in the DEI journey. Why do coalitions need to know about drama and breastfeeding? Learning difficult and painful content can be in itself difficult and painful. Actively learning about historical trauma and the violence rather than knowing it directly is both a privilege and responsibility. Not learning about it perpetuates unintended harm. Without this work, we cannot show up as a full partners. Without this work, we cannot fully understand a person's knowledge, attitudes, and behavior related to breastfeeding. Without this work, we perpetuate space and behavior that causes harm to our fellow lactation advocates. You will see this slide several times in this session. It is a reminder for all of us to take a breath, pause, and review our emotions or feelings. It is a moment to make sure each of us have what is necessary to work through a difficult and sensitive topic. Please take breaks as you need them. When you see this slide, please pause and make sure you are meeting your personal and emotional needs. Thank you.
So hello, this is Linda Kopecky, and I just want to speak to a moment about how we're structuring this session. So we're structuring it with ORID, O-R-I-D, and I'll explain that in a moment. But this is a way that when you go back to your coalition or your community, you could structure a conversation. This is a nice way to structure a conversation around a difficult topic. It divides it into 4 parts. And so we'll be dividing this session into those 4 parts. We'll be very explicit about when we move from one of these to the next, so you can see how we're doing it. And then perhaps if you need to engage in a difficult conversation about historical trauma, historical violence, racism, DEI with your coalition, you can use this as a model. So it's ORID. Objective, you start with facts, history, stories. Then you move into feelings or reflection, asking the participants to take it all in. What is their gut telling them? How are they feeling? What do the reflections tell them? Then you move into interpretive. What does this mean? From what I've learned about history, from what I feel, how is that in the face of the current reality? What I've learned and what I'm feeling, what does this mean for my coalition and how we currently operate? So you interpret. And then the last stage is D, or decisional. Like, what are some next steps given this history, given how we're feeling, what we've reflected on, what it means for our coalition, for our community? What is a next step? So it's a nice way to structure a difficult conversation. We'll be doing that today. Next slide. So we're going to start with objective. We'll spend a bit of time just talking about history and some facts and like the power of storytelling. Again, we're not going to go on this journey for you. We're not going to dig too deep into the connection between trauma and breastfeeding, but we're zooming out. We're giving you a bigger view, because that hard work really has to start at step 1, not at step 10 or step 15. Really need to start at step 1. And we don't know where all the participants are on this call. So we're starting pretty far back at a pretty high level. This is a journey that we encourage all of you to take. So we're going to start with objective. Next slide. So acknowledging the white dominant culture is a really good place to start. And this is talking about history and facts. This document, The White Dominant Culture by Tima Okun, is a good resource. And I'll actually be referring to that in just a moment. And that person says culture is powerful precisely because it is so present and at the same time so very difficult to name or identify. Absolutely. So Miriam, if you could click and get the next image. Many of you may have seen the cultural iceberg. This is a good tool to use when speaking to your coalition or just understanding how culture is understood. And we're talking about that white dominant culture that is so pervasive in the majority of our coalitions and our communities. If you look at the top, that's the culture that we see that's pretty obvious. You know, how old is somebody? What language are they speaking? Gender, and frankly, gender may not be obvious, but their behaviors, physical characteristics, that's what we see, that what tends to be visible. There's so much more that's not visible. So body language, personal values, family structure, relationships, social skills, communication, conflict resolution, history, sexual identity, sometimes gender is a lot less visible, preferences. So these are things that are a lot less visible. And frankly, if you think about it, I invite each of the participants to think about this. For you and your culture, could you clearly articulate all those things that are below the surface? Could you articulate very clearly how your culture amasses knowledge or does conflict resolution or communicates, or your general political views or family structure? I would venture to say not many of us could clearly articulate even our own culture. So a little bit later on, we'll talk about asking a person from a different culture to explain their culture. If you cannot even fully articulate your own culture, how unfair is it to invite somebody else to be that educator and to clearly articulate those things that are very difficult to understand? Kind of a little bit later. I want to bring up this piece about the white dominant culture a little bit more clearly. In that document, The White Dominant Culture, there are some lovely examples of how pervasive the white dominant culture is in all of our communities and our coalitions. And it's not even something that many people know. They're not aware. It's assumed to be the norm. It's assumed to be the way, but it is one way. It is one culture. So think about your coalition, your community, your culture. And I'm going to read some characteristics of the white dominant culture and see if you resonate. It could be your faith community. It could be your neighborhood. So perfectionism is one of those characteristics where mistakes are seen as very personal and they reflect badly on the person rather than the behavior. There's very little time or energy put into reflection or identifying lessons learned. There's a tendency to identify what's wrong rather than appreciating what's right. Another characteristic is a sense of urgency. So continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive or to encourage conversation or thoughtful decision-making. Another characteristic is quantity over quality, where all resources are directed at producing measurable goals. Another characteristic is the high value on the written word, that the belief that there is one right way to do things. And if people are just introduced to that right way, they will see the light and they'll adopt it. So these are all characteristics of that white dominant culture. And if you resonated with some of those, that's not because you personally may be perpetuating it, but everything around us perpetuates that. How funding is structured perpetuates these aspects of the white dominant culture. How governments are structured perpetuates this framework and these characteristics of the white dominant culture. So I encourage everybody to acknowledge and look around and be aware of how your actions and behaviors are really perpetuating that white dominant culture as the culture, the norm, rather than a culture and a way of doing things. And you can see how perpetuating that white dominant culture can be very harmful to others. I am going to, next slide, please. And pass this off to Candy.
Hello, everybody. My turn, and I get to describe, like she had said, the objective and kind of learning about history. So when we divided it into groups for this particular session, it was just by chance that 3 of us in the planning community were Indigenous people. So we didn't want to exclude certain populations, and we wanted to recognize that there are various diverse groups that also experience trauma. So like Linda had said today, this presentation is a little bit more broad, and then we're not really focusing on a specific group of people. But if you do work with a diverse group, we do encourage you to take the time and make the effort to learn more about their history and culture. I give you a warning, be prepared when doing this research. If you find those really reliable and truthful resources, some of it was not taught in the schools for, a reason. Some of the stuff is very shocking, inhumane experiences of stories of groups of people. The attempt to eliminate an entire population or separate families are just kind of examples. And even me as an adult, as an adult Native American Indigenous person, I didn't learn, I think, anything about my history, my ancestors, until I was an adult. So just a fair warning that, history and reliable resources are out there, but take caution and be respectful and make sure you have, like I said, very reliable sources. And also be mindful that history not only affected our past generations, but is still continuing to affect our current generations. And I'll talk more about that later. So the feelings from these, horrific events in the past, a feeling can leave still a person today feeling traumatized or violated to this day. So these are the kind of things, and that Iceberg was a really good reflection of like that invisible pain, almost that invisible trauma that we kind of forget about. So just kind of keep that in mind that, some people think it happened in the past, but how many generations are we into it? And me being, say, 4th or 5th generation, my age group is still in the process of healing. So therefore, it's vitally important to remember when you're working with these diverse groups is, first of all, to determine how and if trauma occurred. And then that also may be kind of the struggles or an obstacle in successful breastfeeding. Maybe it's that question we didn't ask, or like I said, it's that invisible pain that maybe gets overlooked. So just something to kind of keep in mind when you're surveying the families that you do, and if they're diverse. You may also find that learning about a diverse group's culture is also helpful, and it kind of is intertwined. So if you look at a history book, say, for instance, my own Native American, it'll talk about, treaties and land loss and all of that. And then it really gives you a picture of how that group of people lived. I give presentations a lot, how we lived off the land, hunt, fish, and gather. And so kind of keep that in mind, because a group of people usually want to return to that culture. That is a part of healing. So not only, unfortunately, learning about past traumas, but going forward and remembering that this group of people might be utilizing and really tapping into, or I have clients really searching for, what did my ancestors believe in? What are the traditional ways? Because that's their part of healing. So history and culture, like I said, can go hand in hand and be very useful when you're helping families. So obvious ways, we just kind of listed examples, is reliable books, obviously history books, anything, libraries online, attending culture-specific webinars. I know I've seen a lot more recently, which is awesome. People are wanting to learn about diverse groups, about where they came from, how to help them now, and just taking an interest of a group of people, I think, is beneficial overall. And also, I wanted to include reaching out to experts in the community. If you're especially a new person, if you're not a part of that diverse group, don't be afraid to look for somebody in the community. I happen to be one of them where people ask me to do presentations. I reached out and asked my uncle, like, will you present with me and talk more about culture and tradition? And I'll do like the medical aspect of it. And never got a no. I mean, there's people out there that are willing to share, and that's also a part of our healing. And it's a good notion that people want to learn. And I think it makes everybody optimistic that change is possible. So like I said, the community members, the literature that you can read, all of that can definitely help make positive changes for the future generations. I know all of us are, some of us on the call are, received our certification to be a lactation CLC or IBLC, or maybe you're a part of a group. And I know our hearts are in the right place. We have the certification, the knowledge. I remember my week-long class that I had to take to help moms, but then taking a step back, and when we talked about this particular subject, I was trained and equipped with knowledge how to physically help a mom. Here's a position, here's a correct latch, what I see and what I teach them. But never did I get the chance until now to say, I really need to learn a little bit more about these possible invisible, pain that could affect a mom. So to improve the success, I guess, is we need to remember the possible invisible trauma that may be present, and also to try to include that emotional and spiritual support to our brave breastfeeding women. Next slide. So the science part of it, I've been doing presentations about culture and healthcare considerations, and I came across studies on epigenetics. So if anybody knows of this, it's pretty, I would say simple coming from a science point of view, but the gist of it is, if you see that chromosome at the top, the blue chromosome, they basically took a part of that chromosome, and then that is where they identified how it changes. Epigenetics basically says that if trauma memories have been experienced by a person, it can be stored in their genetic makeup. So it almost like leaves scars on their genetic makeup, basically altering their DNA. So these scars then can change a person's genes. So say alter their stress response, can increase risk for anxiety and depression. And this really opened my eyes a lot. And I, when I first started into healthcare, I was amazed at the high rates of anxiety and depression amongst diverse populations. And then I started to learn about this, and then it kind of made sense. So the change in the DNA can activate a dysfunctional response to stress and puts a person at risk for the development of trauma-related symptoms. So it's a lot of science. Basically know that, and an example is 2 generations above me did experience the boarding schools. So possibly their DNA was scarred. It could have passed on to my grandparents, my parents, and then myself. So I almost would be like the 4th generation. So that could explain possibly the increased rates of anxiety and depression, or even post-traumatic disorder. So another story to help explain, which I did this presentation or gave the explanation to some nursing students, and one of them was like almost in tears. It kind of really hit home for her. So how to better explain it is, the story is basically, think of like a science lab. So a scientist had baby lab rats in a cage, and their parents were exposed to the wild outdoors, feared cats, all of that. But the lab rats, no, that's their home. That's where they live. They didn't have any exposure. So one would think no exposure should equal, no fear response, no excess anxiety, if they came into contact with a cat, because they never had that before. So the test of the theory of epigenetics was that the scientists placed some of the wild cat hairs in the cage, and instantly, majority of all those little baby rats who never even encountered or feared a cat ran to the end or the edge of the cage. They were shaken. They were obviously fearful. And then the scientist had said, after the fear kind of settled down, he took the cat hair out. He said the lab rats kind of started to mingle, but they were never the same. They were never the rambunctious, innocent, probably non-altered DNA cats before. So they basically inherited that altered chromosome or the DNA part from their parents, and they still felt that huge anxiety and stress response, even though they didn't encounter that particular trauma. So if you think of that in aspects of people, I had attended a lecture, and this gentleman was saying he was just shocked that his daughter and couldn't understand why she was severely depressed. And she had none of the risk factors, and she kind of went back. He had no mental health issues. His grandparents didn't, but then he went 2 generations up and, found out the history of his family, and then kind of related it to epigenetics. So very powerful theory, something to think about. And I hope there is more future research on this. And it really makes a person think. I come from a good life. I haven't been exposed to trauma, but I'm definitely at risk for anxiety and depression because what my ancestors have went through. So just food for thought. And like I said, really the importance of, no matter if you don't check, risk factors for, the clients that you see, just know that it may be embedded into their blood, into their DNA, and they may not even know it. So I just encourage everybody to, like I said, do the research, history and culture, and to include the emotional and spiritual components for your clients, and consider those invisible trauma areas. Thank you. Next slide. So this slide is regarding storytelling. And we were asked just to kind of talk about the power of it from the Native communities, Indigenous communities. That's how we learn. Our elders at the Oneida Clinic where I work at, we have an Oneida Wellness program. So there was a committee, and they had to collect information and kind of provide these culture educational sessions for all employees. And there wasn't many books and, kind of literature to go to. So they literally had to go to the elders and listen to stories of our past, stories of the culture. And then they changed that verbal storytelling, and, a lot more is being written. So storytelling is a great, obviously, and vital learning tool for us in our communities. And I also wanted to point out, when I worked for the Menominee Indian School District, they did poverty training, kind of like trauma-informed care training for all staff. And the storytelling came about that it exists in people of poverty, and I think people of diverse backgrounds. So for me, I have a questionnaire to ask pregnant women 10 questions, but literally I'll just say, tell me about your first day at home. And through that, she will tell me and answer all those questions. And they say most often, you just have to be patient and listen throughout the story and you'll get your answers, but that's their way of kind of expressing and in the end, answering your questions. So storytelling, that's my point of view. Stefania, I don't know if anything else to add. I know Stefani's at home with little ones, so she may be listening to stories right now. And our kids too are full of stories.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry. My little girl was just coming in here trying to see what mama was doing.
That's why I said you're probably listening to a little kid's story.
Yes. I think storytelling is very powerful. It's a way that we can help ourselves to understand others. It's a time that we should give and allow people to have the space and feel comfortable in telling their story. I know for myself as a breastfeeding peer counselor, that's one of the things I always start off with is asking them their birth story or how their labor and delivery went, because then that will help give me a better understanding of how I can help support them better in the breastfeeding aspect. And then just in general, I especially in the Indigenous communities, we often go on to our elders and ask them for guidance. And by listening to their stories is powerful and helps us, and especially in relation to the trauma and what they endured going to boarding schools and stuff. Yes, I guess that's pretty much all I have to say.
So this is Linda. I'm wondering if I can add a couple things too to this section. I'm with the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition, and we've tried in the past year to incorporate storytelling more into everything we do, even our meetings. But I also want to caution that when somebody shares a story, and it could be about their culture or themselves, that that is a gift, and that is they're giving of themselves, and they're opening themselves to share something potentially very personal. So what can you do to express your gratitude? What is your gratitude towards that gift of the story? Is it financial compensation? Is it another way to express that gratitude? Because this is a place where you could potentially get into exploitation, exploiting somebody, getting their, collecting that story without providing that gratitude or compensating in some way, just making sure that this is of value. The story is of value. And I just want to comment on this quote, which I love this quote: "Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter." That history, and going back to that slide about history, our textbooks, most of the textbooks that we use, and most of those stories are going to be written by the victor, the one who won, the one from the dominant culture, not the person who received the violence or received the harm. So making sure that when you engage in storytelling or collect storytelling, that there is a gratitude portion, but also who are the storytellers, and making sure that to prioritize storytelling and stories from people who are from the community or from the culture that you want to engage with.
Linda, I also wanted to add, this is Candy. When we talk about reliable resources, that's why I really stress that, because as a young girl, I went through the Oneida Nation schools, and there at that time in the 80s, I'm dating myself, there was no real textbooks, like you said. So our culture and language classes consisted of all of us sitting in a round table and listening to our teachers. And then through maybe the course of 5-10 years, one of my language teachers created an Oneida dictionary, and then they started to put stories on DVDs, and some literature has been written. So That's why I really also stressed reaching out to community members, because for us Indigenous people, we really cherish those stories. And it's been a little delay still as far as getting it in written form.
Absolutely.
Linda, yeah, this is Stefana again. I wanted to kind of just reflect on what you said about how when people tell their stories, how they can use it could be used against them, or they could use it to exploit them. And that's something that I think we all really should think about. I know that that's why a lot of reasons why people do not discuss trauma, because in that right there in itself is even more trauma added on, that exposing, I guess, of them. And like, it's something when people do share a story with us, like one of the commenters said, it's something that you have to let them know that you could trust that this is going to stay between us, and that it's not going to be moved on to other people's ears, unless they feel that they need and want to share it publicly themselves.
Thank you. Next slide. So this is just a pause, a reminder to catch your breath, check in with yourself. Are you meeting your personal needs? The next section is reflective. So the first one was objective, and that's history, facts. You're spending time with the facts, the stories, the concrete part of that conversation. And very few community engagement techniques really go in this direction, the reflective, and think about feelings and reflection. This is one of the reasons I like this method so much, because it does say, okay, check in with yourself. How are you feeling? What are you reflecting? What are you thinking? So next slide. We're going to have a breakout session now. So what I'd like you to do, we're going to break you out into different rooms, and this is not going to be reflecting on how you personally feel about trauma and breastfeeding, but I want you to go to a higher level, please, and reflecting on what you've heard so far. What do you feel is needed? And it could be from USBC or elsewhere for your coalition's journey, embarking on that diversity, equity, inclusion journey, the journey of understanding and appreciating trauma and breastfeeding. Reflecting on what you heard, what do you think is needed from USBC or elsewhere? We'll have 15-minute breakout rooms. Candy and Stefana and I will be able to move from room to room just to check in with you, but this is just a free-flowing discussion. And I'd like in your room, identify somebody who at the end of the breakout room will be able to summarize your conversation in the chat section. So Miriam, feel free to open up the breakout rooms.
I'm actually going to open those up for you all. Before I send you into breakout rooms, I just wanted to encourage you. These are going to be very small groups of 3 to 4. So we encourage you, if you can, turn on your camera. It helps to be in presence with one another. And if your name is still listed as your organization, please change that so that we can identify you in those breakout rooms. Okay, we're going to go ahead and open those up. Sorry about that. What was that, Linda?
Stefana and I ended up in the same room with one other person.
I know. I'm gonna switch everyone. I'm just trying to see who else is kind of floating around.
Okay, thanks. I'm happy to go anywhere.
Perfect. So let's see. I'm going to, I think Stephanie went on in. Stefana went in. I'm going to move Linda into room number 9. Okay. Is there anyone else? Jenny, Michelle, are you having trouble joining your room?
It was weird. Sort of got bumped off.
You got removed from your room? Oh no. Okay.
Yeah, I got bumped. I started moving and then I got bumped off of.
I'm going to
Zoom.
move you into number 10.
Okay, excellent. I'll just stay there for about 5 minutes and then come back out.
Sounds good.
Sebastian.
Miriam,
No problem moving?
Miriam, we can actually pause the recording so that we don't have to edit all this out. Or you can keep it in.
It could be from USB-C or it could be from elsewhere. What's needed for your coalition to embark on the diversity, equity, inclusion journey? And particularly understanding history, trauma and history on that journey. What do you need? So feel free to write that in the chat section. And we have a lot of different coalitions represented today, a lot of different types of coalitions represented today. So I'm going to read some things from the chat section. So one is a race and equity subcommittee or board. So a group of people within your coalition that are dedicated to driving the process, right? Speaking out. Acknowledgement of what has happened historically and the impact that it has that's created institutionalized racism and bias. A better understanding of how different histories have created that. So distance may be a barrier for coalitions to work together. And more outreach to Indigenous communities in your area. One room said ownership of the functions of their coalition by the members of the coalition. Bravery, speaking the truth, help with managing racial issues, understanding that it's a continual process. We were talking about a journey here, definitely talking about a journey. Recognizing personal bias. Welcoming diverse members of the coalition. So if you look at that phrase, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's an arc. It's not one or the other, it's a path. So starting with diversity, moving through inclusion, or moving through equity, arriving at inclusion, it's an arc. So diversity, definitely first step is, do you even have diverse members? Okay, thank you. And then another one about working in rural communities, how rural communities can be really different from urban communities, especially thinking about diversity in different cultures. So what do you have any, I'm thinking these may not be needs particularly from USBC, but these are needs for your coalition for getting off on that journey. But if you can consider any needs that USBC can provide for helping your coalition, whatever size, whatever type, to move forward on that journey of understanding trauma and breastfeeding, understanding history, on that diversity, equity, inclusion journey. One person said a need is more control or more personal, each person having more personal agency. And then more outreach. So let's go to, and the request for USBC is speakers or trainers for meetings or conferences. I know that USBC definitely has a call out for equity experts, for equity champions. I mean, I think we've all seen that on the messages from USBC calling for equity champions. So these are people within all of our communities that have the experience and the willingness and the training to speak to equity, to speak to diversity and inclusion. And that could definitely be a resource that you can tap USBC for. Let's move to the next slide. This is another pause. Checking with Miriam. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. There should be one before this. Yes. This is just another pause. So not sure about the conversations you had in your breakout rooms, but this is another invitation to catch your breath. Are your needs being met? If you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, meet your needs, take a break when you need to. And this is definitely something you can incorporate in any conversations you're starting with your coalitions. Okay, next slide. The next section is the third one, which is interpretive. It's the first, as you remember, the first one is objective. What are the facts? The second one is reflective. How are we feeling? How we're reflecting? And this section is, what does this mean? What does this mean? So given what you've learned and you heard and you reflected on, what does this mean? So for each of the next 4 slides, I'm going to have the planners start with giving examples, but then you can put examples of resources or examples in the chat section. So let's go to the first one. So what does this mean for yourself personally? Is it not moving? Here we go. So what does this mean for individuals? I'll just read these off, but I'd like the planners to chime in, please, with some examples. What does this mean? So personally, individually, on your journey, listen deeply for understanding. Really check your own personal biases, understand your own personal biases. Seek, and we talked about this in the history section, actively seek books, movies, podcasts, content from a different cultural lens, speakers, and assume a posture of learning and humility. So I'm wondering if any of the planners have any examples of what does this mean personally?
Hi, Linda, this is Candy. I think for me on an individual level, it was first to be aware of trauma being present or an obstacle, and then how do I move forward sensitively in helping my clients.
Thank you. Any other examples? I do know that one that I personally, as a white middle-class person, that I have tried very hard to do is seeking out books, movies, podcasts, lots and lots of podcasts, lots of storytelling. I seek out the podcasts that include storytelling, but from different cultural lens. I feel like that helps me for a moment or two walk in other people's shoes and see the world from a different perspective. And feel free to put in the chat section, do you have any resources or ideas that really speak to this? I'm just going to spend just a moment quickly if anybody wants to add something to chat. And one person says we all have experts in our own communities. Definitely.
Linda, I didn't know if this was an appropriate time to mention the testimonials that we received.
Yes, please do.
So originally when we met, we thought about how we can help clients dealing with trauma. And it all goes back to, like, I could never tell my client, I know how you feel. So we reached out and asked, brave women if they were able to share their stories or do an interview. And Stefani and I also each got a woman to answer and interview questions real bravely, told the truth, told what happened, said how what helped, what didn't. Very excellent. And we decided to share at the end. So the testimonials will be, I believe, links at the end, one from the United Nations and then one from Kansas where Stefani is. So if you feel and are ready to listen to them, feel free to. And it's just an idea to go forward to use amongst your population and the people you work with. And I think another individual reflection or realization that I had is just the strength, tremendous strength these women have. And if they're in a really good place in their life, so willing to help and to share, to, I guess, help future women in a situation that they're at. So I was just amazed and proud at the woman I interviewed. And at the end, I'll read a letter that she had wrote that could be used also. That was another tactic. The interview, I didn't feel like I captured everything that she said. So then I went back to her and I said, would you mind writing a letter to somebody that might be in your situation? What words would you tell them? And I can read that to you guys later.
Definitely.
Thank you, Candy, for mentioning that. I just want to put a little input on that as well. The testimonial aspect of this, when I reached out to a client of mine, it was very powerful, and we actually talked a long time about it, and it even helped me open up about my own personal and physical trauma. So I think I took it, that brave aspect of it was also healing, to be able to be comfortable enough to be open up myself, and that we have to remember that we are just peers to one another and human.
Thank you. I think the first one on this list is one of the most important in listening deeply. Because when you listen deeply to another person's story, you discover more about your own story. Next slide. So what does this mean for your relationships? How you interact with other humans in the world? So again, learn first, ask second. So do your homework first, which is really what that means. We talked a little bit about this earlier, about being aware of asking others to teach about their cultures. It's assuming that that person can fully articulate everything that's below the water in the iceberg. And how many, it takes a lot of self-awareness and maybe a lot of diving into history to be able to fully articulate that. So that's a huge expectation of other people. And it's not another person's responsibility. It's our own personal responsibility to learn first and ask second. Put yourself in places where you can be more fully in contact with a variety of people. Put yourself in a room or in a situation where you are the cultural minority. If you're white, many people are always, are like 95% of the time the cultural minority. We're in their rooms. But I'm asking people who are white, put yourself in a situation where you are definitely in the minority. But create opportunities where you're more fully in contact with a variety of people. And check in with your colleagues who may be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, BIPOC colleagues and friends, to see if support is desired and how support is desired. So I'm going to open this up to the planners and see if you have any content or any suggestions.
Linda, this is Candy. I just want to, first of all, thank you for kind of explaining the iceberg in a very well manner. I know it's at times difficult for people to, kind of point out pros and cons of the white dominant society, and you did it very well. So the opportunity to be fully in contact with a variety of people, I think we're all doing that as we practice. The ladies that I talked to in the breakout rooms had many diverse populations that they dealt with. And as far as asking about, cultures, it kind of has like two sides to it, like she had said. When I had said, be prepared once you get reliable resources or community members to talk to you about it, because it may be hurtful to you, or a huge eye opener, or overwhelming. So, and if a person truly seeks out information, I hope that their heart is pure and they'll take it in, but just realize that it can take a toll on a person. So just proceed with caution and know that in the end, it's only going to benefit the way you practice.
I want to just lift up a comment from the chat section that when we're talking about diversity, right now we're reflecting a lot about race and culture, but somebody did mention the diversity of ableism, that when a person has a disability, they're often the only person with a disability in just about every room. And so that's when we're thinking about diversity, what does diversity mean, and thinking beyond culture and race. But we're all in this technical assistance session, we're linking this particularly to trauma and breastfeeding and historical trauma. And definitely that aspect of ableism is fully a part of the role of trauma and breastfeeding. Any other comments from the planners or any comments in the chat section about what does this mean for interpersonal relationships?
I think for me, this is Jacob. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. I think one of the problems that I'm still trying to work out just in a personal level, but affects my interpersonal relationships, is the anger that I have just about what's happened historically with Indigenous people and the way that's impacted culture and language, and some of the impacts on traditional lifestyles, including breastfeeding. So that's something that I know that I have to constantly be aware of when I'm having conversations with other people.
Thank you. Absolutely a very important piece of this. Any other comments from the planners or comments in the chat section about what does this mean for interpersonal relationships?
Hi, Linda. Stefana again. I want to say that I'm on two breastfeeding coalitions myself, and one being tribal indigenous, and then one being more statewide. With the statewide Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, we have a good mix of people on our board, and it has been helpful in taking that back into my own coalition, which is predominantly indigenous, and maybe looking out to see opening it up so that people don't feel that it's just strictly indigenous, because our community is pretty big and it's a wide range of ethnicities. In that sense, that do you have to just be exclusive in that sense, I guess, is a question. Because I wouldn't want to turn anybody away that wanted to advocate for breastfeeding.
So that's a question. That's potentially a resource that USBC can help with is what is the, and USBC does have these cultural identity caucuses, which is an outgrowth of a certain, of the Crossroads anti-racism training. So that's a part of that, but what is that place for culturally specific coalitions, groups, identity caucuses? I mean, is that the question, Stefana? What is there, what is that place? And it does have a place.
Yes.
So that, when think about what we need from USBC, that could be a really good resource from USBC, is helping coalitions identify the time and place for those culturally specific groups, coalitions, identity caucuses, when those are important and how they interact with these diverse coalitions. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for giving what information you give, because that's something I've always been wanting to know myself, and now have that kind of knowledge to navigate through it and maybe seek in some more information.
In Minnesota, we have a Hmong Breastfeeding Coalition, but I attend all the meetings as their liaison with the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition. So I'm the only non-Hmong person who attends those coalitions. Am I a member? Am I not? I mean, that's what's my role? So that's an interesting point. Just reflecting on the chat section, one person is mentioning that the interpersonal, what this means for interpersonal relationships is being ready or willing for the pushback that you might get with those relationships. And actually, Miriam, can you go to the next slide? Because Norma actually speaks nicely to when we talk about what does this mean for your coalition. So there may be pushback, and being ready for the pushback. And that when we think about the aspects of that white dominant culture, that there's one way, and that if other people just figure out what that one way is, they'll all be on board with that one way. Well, there's multiple ways. And the way we're all operating is usually, normally, an aspect or an outgrowth of that white dominant culture. So what does this mean for your coalition? I want to open this up to the planners. What does this mean for your coalition? What can you do with your coalition? Do you bring in presenters? Do you attend workshops or trainings? Do you hold listening sessions for the coalition? What about understanding truth and reconciliation? We're providing a number of resources to you after this technical assistance session. And one of them is a wonderful video called Dawnland. And it clearly explains the residential boarding school system where Native American children and even infants totally separated from their families and taken to boarding schools, and you'll learn more about that when you dive into that history. But truth and reconciliation is a path of a healing path. I know in South Africa they've had an entire Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. In Canada, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the country, working with First Nations. So what about prioritizing BIPOC-centered planning? What about seeking strategic partnerships? I'm going to open this up for the planners to comment.
So this is Candy. The examples listed, or I'm not sure they're examples, or but bring in presenters, definitely, if it's a history, culture, or area that you're not an expertise in, that would be awesome. Workshops and trainings, they become more available. Listening sessions, definitely, you know, you're sending the message to a population. We want to learn more about you. We care about you. Tell me what's going good and tell me, you know, what needs improvement is always, I think, beneficial and appreciated. And then strategic partnerships, definitely reaching out, possibly to other coalitions. The lady in my last group had said, she almost said like 6 different groups. And I asked if there were, you know, specific support groups in each group, and there were some and there were not. So how awesome would it be if they each had their own particular support group, yet they met together, you know? And I mean, why reinvent the wheel is always my saying. So I'm always looking for ideas, somebody to partner with. And someone had great ideas in our other session is even think outside the box. We were talking about, you know, Breastfeeding Coalition events, and you know, why not reach out to, you know, probably agencies and programs that you wouldn't even think of. And the reason behind that, which she had mentioned, that is funding. So if you're going to hold the event, really think outside the box and invite a partner to a table that, you know, maybe nobody ever did before. So just being creative and creating those partnerships is awesome.
And then for myself, when I was starting out and forming my breastfeeding coalition in my community, I reached out to other Indigenous coalition leaders to see how they have navigated their coalition to help. And I did it in a way where I asked the question, because you have to be careful how you ask. It's not like you want to take what they did, but it had been very, very beneficial for me. And I actually have gained friendships in those outreach. And it has helped me in my coalition, where, you know, attending the workshops and trainings, try to betterment myself for that. And then also getting on other state coalitions, seeing how they run their coalitions, and seeking that partnership and collaboration is hugely beneficial for coalitions.
And also to add, with creating those partnerships, you're actually expanding the knowledge and awareness about trauma. So I think that is exceptional. Often we find ourselves working in silos, trauma-informed care work only at say, the health or medical field level, or only at the school level. So I think that also is a huge advantage too, is bringing in partners, and then you're actually, providing education and awareness of trauma amongst the groups that you work with.
I want to reflect a little bit on what I'm seeing in the chat. And first, talking about reconciliation as a point of feeling very stuck. And I just want to highlight that purple bar, that instead, it's not truth or reconciliation, it's truth and reconciliation, definitely. And what I see and observe from my corner of the world is that a lot of people want to jump right over truth and try to embody reconciliation without being truthful and acknowledging history and acknowledging the current situation. That truth can be very hard and it can be bypassed. And I just want to lift up, Jacob, I'm wondering if you can speak to that, what you comment about the self-healing community framework, because I think that, to me, that speaks really clearly to engaging in truth before moving to reconciliation. Could you speak to that, your suggestion?
Yeah, it's so just within the realm of work that I do, we had found this framework through work that we were doing with adverse childhood experiences and looking at epigenetics and looking at trauma and the role it plays within our bodies, and then the intergenerational role it plays. And so the self-healing community framework really acknowledges, from a community perspective, what has happened, utilizing that community voice through community-driven processes, just with that understanding of historical trauma and the impact it plays within systems within that community. So it was just a rare opportunity for you to look at what's happened and the impact it has had, even if you were to do this within your coalitions, as a way to kind of not only acknowledge what has occurred, but also within the voices of the individuals that were impacted by it. And so you're offering that opportunity for them to share from their own perspective, and that's part of that empowerment piece to build from, so that when you're creating these conversations, you're also creating a universal language that you could speak within. And that language is really an essential part of how you want to relay your messaging and communication around it, especially when it comes to some of these things that are more sensitive topics. And so that would be the main key point, is that you really want these to be community-driven efforts, and acknowledging that language that they're using when they're talking about traumas, like even historical trauma in some different indigenous communities, it's known as soul wounding, and that's how they'll talk about it. Epigenetics, blood memory. And so there's First Nations tribes, or First Nations reserves that we'll talk about it in that way. So language is extremely important, especially when it's being developed within the community around these topics. And so creating those opportunities for meaningful conversations is key.
Thank you so much. And just another comment from the chat section: finding and supporting programs and community cultural supports that counterbalance trauma with resiliency supports.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob, so much for what I'm thinking about that you just said is that common language, and how important that common language is, that universal language. So
What's she doing?
that's something I'm going to definitely take.
What are you doing?
Let's move to the next slide.
Yeah, sometimes we go back and forth. What are you doing?
Want some cover here?
Oh, let's go to the next slide, Miriam. So what does this mean for your community? If your coalition is part of your community, what does this mean for your community and your partners and the community in which your clients and families live in? The people you interact with are living in this community. So with your partners and your community, promoting model programs, learning about promising practices, holding community listening sessions, learning about reparations. I know there are some communities that are starting to enact reparations. So what does that mean, and learning about it? Previous slide was learn about truth and reconciliation in the community, advocate for it. And then collaboratively plan BIPOC-centered activities. Does anybody else have any comments what this means for your community? And I just want to comment on one in the chat section. And this is, I think, from Elsa, the Binational Breastfeeding Coalition. To being inclusive, and what does this mean for your community? She talks about providing Spanish-English interpretation, but is there linguistic access to all these activities? Is everybody able to understand the work that's happening? So I'm going to open this up for the planners to comment on what does this mean for your community?
First thing that comes to mind is start, continue, or proceed with healing. Oftentimes, this is a topic people are afraid to bring up. And I think even just the small step that I took in interviewing somebody, she really kind of took that to heart and was appreciative and said, I want to continue to help others. So I'm a part of the Professional Night at Breastfeeding group, and then we also have a parent one. And so I'm going to just kind of mention it to her and see if, possibly they could do when and if we ever restart, do, healing circles, talking circles, something about, just healing in general. Because I think it's needed, and especially in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of families are hurting for several reasons. So I think what I've learned in this journey has led me to is sharing this information with our smaller parent group, and kind of start small and kind of see where it goes from there.
Thank you.
I agree. I think that we need to start having more spaces for this, and having those healing circles and such. I don't think we have enough of that. I know when I lost my mom, reaching out to other women that had lost their mom was healing for me. And it made me ask that question. It's like, why don't we have something where we can come together and discuss and talk and share stories on that? So it would mean something for our community that maybe taking that step up to having and facilitating those sessions.
Thank you. So Jacob put a link to the self-healing community framework in the chat, and we'll definitely have that on the resource list for everybody after this TA session. Danae is putting a plug in for the USBC's identity caucuses. They are places where you can be with other people from your culture, and they are contained spaces, so you can have those personal, deep, meaningful, vulnerable conversations. Any other comments, or what does this mean for your community? Any other comments or suggestions or best practices? Candy, I want to, I know you, in the beginning of planning this, you had spoken to in Wisconsin how the trauma-informed care trainings are fairly universal and they're fairly widespread. So creating that, when we talk about that common language, that trauma-informed care trainings being so widespread is really creating that common language and that universal language. Can you speak to that?
So in Wisconsin, definitely the amount of trainings have increased. I know several organizations and programs that receive the training, but the implementation still is not as universal as it should be. A tribe north of me, Menominee Nation, did do their entire tribal reservation program services. They were all trained in trauma-informed care. And us here in Oneida, we are working on our strategic plan, and one of them is to actually implement trauma-informed care. We're going to start small. The medical clinic is one of 5 health facilities, so we're going to start with community health. I'm actually signed up for a training in mid-May, and I know there's different strategies and frameworks of, how to implement it, but we're starting out small, and just because we see the need to, kind of implement this within our healthcare system. So Wisconsin, I'm not sure how it rates to other states, but at least we kind of have one foot forward in learning and implementing trauma-informed care.
Thank you. So we're going to move to the next slide, and then we're going to have another breakout room. But this is another moment to pause, check in with yourself, take a deep breath. Okay, let's move into the next portion. We had the objective, the reflective, the interpretive, and now it's the decisional. Now is a time when if you're leading this conversation, and in this conversation, we can be concrete. Not just what does it mean for a coalition, but what can we do? What is our next step? What is our first step? How do we embark on this journey? So we're going to have a 15-minute breakout room, and we're going to mix it up. So you'll be with different people and think about what are the next steps. It could be the first step for you, for yourself as an individual, for yourself as your individual or your relationships, for your coalition, or for your community. So this is a time to be concrete and to make some decisions. That's why it's called the decisional section. Make some decisions about the future. So please open up the breakout rooms. So people are coming back, and welcome back.
I think everyone's here.
Really good discussion. I had a good discussion in my breakout session, and I'm hoping you all did, identifying your personal next steps, your coalition next steps, your community next steps. Let's move to the final slide. And Candy, I'm going to pass this to you, and then it'll be USB-C to finish up.
All right. So, thank you for incorporating that picture. I found that online, and it spoke to I'm actually reading part of the testimonial. I know I had said before I got the community member's testimonial, and then I had her write this letter. So she gave me permission to read it. So this is to one brave nursing mom to another. You are not alone, and you are a survivor. I've been where you are, and I overcame huge barriers in my journey. I succeeded with self-determination and the hope to change things for my own children and family. It was not easy, but it made me stronger and more confident. Our Creator put us here on this earth to be beautiful, resilient, and strong women. You are capable of more than you realize. My wish for you in this breastfeeding journey is healing. This is our tradition. Take back your power. I am already proud of you. You got this, and we got you. An Oneida enrolled member. Thank you for joining us today. Had some great discussions in the breakout session. Thank you for all you do for the breastfeeding moms throughout the US. And I wish you well, and from me.
Thank you, Candy. Okay, Miriam, take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kenny, and thank you everyone for this wonderful session. So we are going to be sharing a couple of updates from USBC, and Danae just shared the first is a satisfaction survey. For today's section, it should take no more than 5 minutes, and it will definitely help us for the design of our future sessions. So if you can do that for us, that would be great. And also please save the date for the next 2 TA sessions in this series. We have communication and styles and methods coming up, as well as quick ideas for coalitions. And we look forward to seeing you all there. So we know that every coalition is unique, and as such, each coalition has unique needs. So you can now request technical assistance from the USBC through a brief online form. It asks you to provide your contact information, including the name of your coalition and a brief summary of what you need assistance with, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And Danae just shared that link in the chat.
Okay, so you heard Linda mention earlier in the session, and I also shared in the chat that we do host identity caucuses, and it's really part of our efforts to create a landscape of breastfeeding support. So we'll be hosting another set. We usually host these at least twice a year, and so we'll be hosting these online identity caucuses to allow individuals of the same identity to be in community with one another. And while USBC's diversity, equity, and inclusion support mainly focuses on helping organizations and coalitions operationalize DEI, we recognize that there's a personal journey that each individual has to take. And so these identity caucuses are facilitated safe spaces and can be used to share stories and strategies toward allyship, solidarity, and liberation. And you'll notice that our caucuses are mainly focused, racially focused. And that is because USBC leads with race. And why is that? It's because without exception, racial inequities persist in every system across the country. We encourage you to look at our nation's systems, look at health and education and criminal justice, employment, and even in the breastfeeding field, and access to breastfeeding supports. USBC is leading with race because when you look within other dimensions of identity, when you look at income and gender and sexuality and education, ability, age, citizenship, and geography, there are inequities based on race. And with knowing that, we can move our work forward with an intersectional approach while always naming that role that race plays in people's experiences and outcomes. So we really encourage you to take the journey with us and join your caucus so that we can collectively work toward creating a world with thriving families and communities.
Thanks, Danae. And if you enjoyed today's sessions, you will not want to miss out on the 2021 National Breastfeeding Conference and Convening. This year, this conference is going to be fully online and will cover advocacy, community resilience, and emergency preparedness and response. There'll also be opportunities for networking with your peers from around the country, and registration is open currently. And if your coalition is a member of the USBC, there is also a $100 discount for all of your coalition's members. So that conference will be held June 9th to the 11th, and continuing education status is pending. And if you have any questions about registration or the conference in general, you can email conference@usbreastfeeding.org. And if you have any questions regarding membership, you can email membership@usbreastfeeding.org.
Okay, and finally, the USBC is inviting its network of members and affiliated coalitions to participate in a diversity, equity, and inclusion project. So this data collection project is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and it will assess the adoption and integration of racial equity practices and principles in the first food fields programs and services. The data collection includes an organizational interview, which is supposed to be completed by one representative from your coalition or organization, and then 4 complete DEI questionnaires. All of the data that we collect during this project will be de-identified in the final report and any other communications that we produce. So any organization or coalition that fully participates in this DEI project by providing those 5 data points will receive 1 free registration to the 2021 National Breastfeeding Conference and convening. So if your coalition has an active group profile in the USBC website, your listed contact received instructions earlier today on how to participate. If you have any questions regarding the project, please feel free to email deisurvey@usbreastfeeding.org.
Thank you. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us and for all that you do. Thank you, Linda, Candy, and Stefana, and everyone for participating. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.